Right, thanking God for kindness and the way in which it can help us to set healthy priorities, a theme that we talk about from time to time. Let's actually call this chapter Passover, because I think it is actually going to connect both to kindness and healthy priorities by the time we get to the end of the chapter. That is generally going to describe the way in which John takes pains to emphasize, as much as any other gospel, the fact that Christ's crucifixion took place during the Passover, and in particular, it's going to coincide with what he is going to call the day of preparation during Passover, something that we have seen low-key in chapter 18, but it's going to become more of a thing here in chapter 19, where the first 11 verses are going to be a continuation of the hearing or trial or whatever you want to call it that Jesus is experiencing prior to his crucifixion, as Pilate is going to look for reasons to release him, but he is not going to be able to reason with the crowd. And so in an attempt to appease them, he is going to treat Jesus rather shamefully, but it's not going to work. And so he is eventually going to yield to the pressure to deliver over to crucifixion one in whom he has found no guilt, as we've seen before. That's the famous part of the story. But going on from verses 12 through 16, finding no way out, he is going to hand him over to the crowd that seems to lack self-awareness, because in that section we are going to see our first reference to the day of preparation in verse 14, as the crowd is going to essentially demand for him to be crucified. Going on from verses 16 through 27, he is going to be turned over to the band of soldiers, and instead of giving a thorough summary, which it probably deserves, the interesting contrast I saw there was the soldiers, who have no particular issue with Jesus, but as we're going to see in, once again, Peter's sermon in Acts 2, they are going to seem to represent the lawless people to whom the Christ was turned over by his own people for crucifixion. And in that regard, they're going to fulfill the prophecy about the way his garments will be divided up by basically looking out for themselves in this time when this man isn't even getting basic justice. And so they're going to divide up his stuff as he's being killed wrongly. But he, even in the midst of his suffering, is going to be looking out for others in this famous passage that tells his mother, as she is being left behind after his death, much like his apostles, that John, the apostle whom he loved, is presumably, or seems to be in this chapter, the one to whom he is giving to his mother as a son to look after her. And it's going to say that he is going to take her into his home from that very hour. I think it's literally going to say verses 28 through 30, quite possibly building on that concept of the lawless men around him to whom he's been turned over for crucifixion, but possibly not. It could actually show mercy in that at the point he states outwardly that he thirsts, someone is going to give him some sour wine that was available nearby at the place where they're doing the crucifixion. This might mean one of two things. I've heard it interpreted different ways, and I don't know for sure. But if you look at the larger context of the Gospels, these men, among others, were heavily engaged in mocking him at this point. And so it could simply be a continuation of the mocking that not only the soldiers had engaged in, but the chief priests and others in the crowd had engaged in. But on the other hand, it could be a sign of mercy and humanity, understanding that I've heard some say that the sour wine might have had a soothing effect on the suffering. And even though it was sour, it might not have been great to taste, but it might have had the effect of, in some ways, not necessarily numbing the pain, but maybe easing it, as we mentioned. But beyond that, whichever direction it goes, it does not prevent what is eventually going to happen, and that is in verses 31 through 37, where we're going to see the second reference to the Passover, or specifically the day of preparation in verse 31, as they have requested, since it is the day of preparation and they would love to be able to be ceremonially clean and on time for eating the Passover, they're going to ask that it come at the expense of Christ's additional suffering, as they're going to ask that their legs be broken. But as they have broken the legs of the thieves on either side of the Christ that were being crucified along with him, they're going to find that by the time they get to the Christ, that he is already dead. And so instead of breaking his legs at their request, his side is going to be famously pierced, at which point blood and water is going to pour out of his side. But It is going to be in keeping with the prophecy that none of his bones would be broken, like the Passover lamb. Going on though in verses 38 through 42, after we realize that, as prophesied, none of his bones will be broken, it is going to help us to see that third reference to the day of preparation or the Passover in verse 42, where it helps us to see that, as we've seen before in the previous Gospels, Joseph of Arimathea is going to step up, and as we have seen low-key throughout the Gospels, he's always going to be, seem to be a subtle presence advocating for Jesus when the rest of his clique, I think he was amongst the religious leaders of the time, were trying to have him crucified. And even though, as we've seen before, that he was not successful in preventing the crucifixion because it was from God as a sacrifice for us all, he is still going to be consistent in his devotion to the Christ, taking him during the time of preparation, this time along with Nicodemus, we see in John's gospel, another one who was low-key consistent. Even if he was not confident in his pursuit of Jesus, he was consistent in at least trying to show some kind of loyalty to the truth and therefore to the Christ. And so he and Joseph, Nicodemus and Joseph, are going to, ironically enough, be involved in his burial at the time of preparation, understanding that going all the way back to the law. One of the things that most caught my attention about this chapter is the way in which they seem to put themselves at jeopardy of being ceremonially unclean during the time of Passover, understanding that by law it was a defilement to have contact with a dead body. And so they are not only taking the body of Jesus, but they are preparing it for burial, putting the spices on it, quite possibly coming in direct contact with his body, but not getting things out of order and twisted. Their kindness guided them to show a greater sense of priority, understanding what we see in Matthew 23, around verse 23, in the famous section we mentioned before about the woes, where it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel." And so in risking superficial uncleanness and coming into contact with a dead body, Nicodemus and Joseph seem to have shown the kindness that the rest of their peers lacked in maintaining a desire to keep their ceremonial cleanliness, not going near Pilate, a Gentile, during the time of Passover, and likewise not doing any of the other things that would have kept them from outwardly being presentable during the Passover, all the while they were committing a murder, reminding me of ways that we can all be tempted to strain at the gnat, yet swallow the camel, proverbially making much of small things while accepting great evils. And then likewise, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, the way that we can look at another, or more specifically, the speck or splinter in a brother's eye, while accepting in our own lives great logs or larger versions of the same thing that we see and condemn in another. But on a more encouraging note, the thing that might have most caught my attention was the way that Nicodemus and Joseph saw themselves, or saw their way out of the hypocrisy surrounding them, by simply applying something else that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount toward the end, the very famous golden rule: do unto others the way that you would have them do to you, reminding me that the key to all of these legal principles, whether it's the ceremonial cleanliness for the Passover, or the way in which we handle ourselves around dead bodies under the old law, or every other portion of the law connected to those principles, the key to applying all of those principles correctly then as now is in genuinely loving God and the people around us, understanding that a greater sin than possibly coming in contact with a dead body was leaving the body of an innocent man unattended while we go enjoy dinner, in particular, a dinner to honor the God of justice and mercy and kindness.